Hey my friends, this is the only video where I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy for probably a fair while. Strap yourselves in, I'm going to structure it as a worst to best main Final Fantasy game series list. I'm leaving off the online ones because I never played them. I hear they're really good though. And I'm also leaving out a lot of the side story games. There used to only be a couple, but now if you included every spin-off, it'd be a way longer video. It'll be twice as long at least. There's more spin-offs now than there is main series games. It's gone a bit crazy. So main series Final Fantasies to me, always an event when one comes out. I always take the time to play it. I'll get the console that it's on if I need to, and then I'll play through it, and I'll try and 100% most of them, or at least as much as I possibly can. And it's been a pastime of mine since my first Final Fantasy, which was when I used to go over the back fence and play with my neighbor, he used to have Mario 3 and the original Final Fantasy on his NES. But the original Final Fantasy, because we were like 6-year-old kids, it was like, oh, don't play that one. It's like a grown-up game. That's a boring game. We didn't even understand it. Didn't even register with us, right? So I guess that was probably the first time I saw one. But the first time I actually got into one was Final Fantasy VII for the PC, interestingly enough. I didn't have a newer console. No PlayStations, no Saturns, no Nintendo 64s for a while. I was still sort of on the old Mega Drive, it's the old Sega Genesis or whatever you call it, wherever you're from. And so I had a half decent PC. So I got this Final Fantasy VII PC version. Remember the cardboard box that came in and everything. Back when PC games used to come in a big old box, it was good. And I played it, and I remember I would always play it on the 640 by 480 resolution, which it would run so slowly especially when it would convert to battle mode. But no, I loved it. I wanted that sharp, crisp images, and I became absolutely head over heels for it. I used to write fan fictions about the characters. I used to take screen grabs and try and draw them and stuff and trace over them. And I made like an information book for no one in particular about it once. I just had so much, I just needed to get it out there. It's a bit like how I'm about knives now, I think. You just need to share it, and you have no platform to share it, so you just do all sorts of odd things when you're a kid with a pretty intense focus. Anyway, I went back and played all the ones before that from there, and then from that point onwards, I think shortly afterwards, I did get a PlayStation, and then I could play them on PlayStation, and then through the PlayStation 2 and onwards and upwards. So that's my little brief history. The types of Final Fantasies I like the most, the things I like about the games the most, which is probably what's going to spin this list. I like most of all for it to have a good story. A good story, I'll put up with a lot if the characters and story are great. Then, of course, I really like it needs to have a good battle system. And what I like about the battle system the most is not so much whether it's turn-based or whether it's running around. I like to be able to develop my characters and develop characters that go off in directions and having like a versatile party. That's what I like the most. So probably games that you may like a bit more than me are lower on this list because perhaps the characters were more fixed in roles, or perhaps the characters were more interchangeable or whatnot. So without further ado, let's just start with the list. I'm going to start at the bottom entry, which is of course Final Fantasy II. So Final Fantasy II I feel is less enjoyable than Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy I at least has a pretty good system in place, and Final Fantasy II, what they were trying to do was go story, which should appeal to me, but the story is not particularly good. And the battle mechanics and things hampered it so badly. You could just attack your own party to beef yourself up. It was kind of a broken system from the start. And there was another game with a pretty broken system that I'll talk about a bit later on. You might be able to guess which one that is. But Final Fantasy II just didn't do enough right for it to be better, in my opinion, than the first Final Fantasy, which is the next one on this list. So Final Fantasy I, the original, it's just a bit too old now. Even when you do a remastered a pixel remastered, or the anthology they did for the PlayStation 1, even when you play it in a newer skin, it's still very rustic. There's not much direction to the game. You can't change your classes once you start. It's a starting point, but between this and number 2 and number 3, they sort of got around the kind of games they want to make. So obviously they did a lot for the series, but I'm leaving sentiment out of this list. I'm just going on which games I would enjoy to play most now from worst to best. And number 1, I would probably pick it up over Final Fantasy II, and that's about it. Interesting to see that the Stranger in Paradise new Final Fantasy game is like a prequel or a retelling of this story where you play as Garland, which is interesting. So I'm kind of curious to see how that went, and I do like how they've revisited the heritage and tried to make more out of this, very old, very kind of sparse universe, really. But it's still a second least favorite to me at the moment. Now, Final Fantasy III is my third least favorite. And it's sort of like a very much improved version of Final Fantasy I, but still very weak in the story. They did do a revitalized version of this for the Nintendo DS, and they named the characters, and they had it all felt a bit more like a modern game, but it was still very very grindy. The job system in it was great, and it's what definitely elevates it up above numbers 1 and 2, and you can change jobs and swap things around, and it is almost like a Final Fantasy V quality of job system, but to me, I just can't get through. The story just does not grab me at all. I'm not propelled through the game by a good story or good characters. It's all just very much of an afterthought. So Final Fantasy III is my third least favorite. Jumping into the modern era, very much so, Final Fantasy XIII did not do a great deal for me. It's probably the best looking Final Fantasy game, even as it looks as good as Final Fantasy XV. It really does. It still holds up, and it's a 15-year-old game. Really, really impressive. How it looks, great music, but nothing else about the game really did it for me. The world basically needed to come with its own book for you to understand all these wacky terms it's throwing at you from the beginning. The opening 3 hours of the game are just a slog, so it really hampers replayability. The game doesn't open up and even give you all the paradigms, and let alone the actual game opening up out of like a very linear experience until much, much later on. So to get that starting point, you really need to get about 4 hours into the game at least, which I didn't like. What's hampering this the most is that I really care very little for any of the characters. Lightning, I can see what they were trying to do. They were trying to make a Cloud-esque character, and she's probably the best character in the game. She has some sort of gruff, sort of taciturn, funny moments, but the rest of the cast just did nothing for me. Vanille I found really annoying with her very sort of her Australian accent and her and I know there's reasons for why these characters are written this way, but to me, Vanille was quite annoying. I'd always have it out of my party if I could. A lot about it just didn't gel with me. This is an Australian person. Didn't really like her voice specifically. I didn't mind Fang. Snow, I couldn't stand. Hope, I couldn't stand. Saz was just a complete downer for most of the game. There wasn't really anything propelling me through it. And then, as I said, the world and story were just a little bit too incomprehensible. They got so keen on it. You can tell in their writer's room, they were probably weaving themselves up into really tangled, amazing stories that between all of them were probably just fab. But it just got so lost in communication. And then on top of that, the Crystallium system was like a weaker sphere grid for character development. And then the paradigm system really did make it seem like the characters were very much interchangeable. Like there wasn't really a need to develop them all particularly. I know you could link it. It was linked to the crystal, system a little bit, but it just felt very neutral, and all the characters felt very neutral and swappable. So 13 looked great, sounded great. Didn't really like a great deal else about it. Now, from this point onwards, all these games are quite good, and I think they're quite universally appreciated. I don't think anyone's going to hate many of the games, maybe apart from a couple of them from this point onwards. Any of these next games, I'd be really happy to just jump in and replay the whole thing. But following on from 13, my fifth least favorite game is Final Fantasy IV. So Final Fantasy IV, I used to think was like the first good story game, and I used to think it was so much better than 5 because it had the good story. These are the things, the kind of groupthink that exists around Final Fantasy IV a bit. I've played through it recently, and the story isn't that great. It's okay for a very rudimentary mid-90s game, but it's very serious, and it doesn't particularly, it doesn't really have much it's so linear. It doesn't really have much that you can drift off and explore, and the game just basically takes you all through from start to finish. And there are some side quests and things later on, but it doesn't really feel like as complete a world as I used to think it did. So this is one on hindsight, I've ranked it lower than I thought I would. And that's paired with the character system. I didn't like how some of the characters would just leave the party entirely. Your final 5 characters, they're just fixed. So I would love for you to be able to bring back Yang, bring back, I'd never use him, but bring back Cid even, bring back Palo and Porum. And I know there's been some like more recent versions where you can do versions of this. But yeah, I never particularly gelled with a couple of the characters as well. I didn't like particularly how they were just fixed in their roles and they just leveled up and learned stuff as they leveled up. There wasn't any variability, and even that you couldn't even choose your party. It's such a fixed, rigid Final Fantasy game. Number 9 did this so much better later on, and I'll talk about number 9 later on. But number 9, you could at least vary some things in your party or develop certain things in your party. And you could choose your characters basically at any time from, half the game onwards. So that's sort of, how I feel about 4. It's not aged as well with me. Then it's Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15, a really different game, and they often completely break the mold. Since 7, every new Final Fantasy has been particularly different to the last one, and I love how they do that. 15 really didn't work for me that well originally, but it's when you have to get the full stupid royal version, which, if you just got the basic 15, it is just, there's not enough fleshed out in it. It's an amazing looking game, and I love just the scale of it, like how big the Eidolons are and how big the world is, and seeing these crazy giant Final Fantasy monsters against these quite realistic looking scenarios. Love how it looks. I liked the idea of the party. Starts off, that's your starting 4. You get used to them, and it's really character driven, so there's not really that whole thing where it wouldn't feel right in this story to be able to swap your party out just because of how they're formed and why they are all together. I would say that this is somewhat let down by its intensely repetitive action-oriented battle system, which once you sort of get the hang of, it's very, very easy, and there's just not enough mixing and matching between the characters. There's some special moves which I always sort of found myself never really bothering to implement. And there's a lot of it is sort of, even using the Eidolons to throw back to that, it's very specific, and it's all very, the game just wants to tell you a story, and it almost doesn't have as much game in it that I thought I would. But it's a great story, and I loved, this is probably my second or third favorite Final Fantasy bad guy in this game. Arden is such a good antagonist with such understandable motivations, obviously within this wacky world. But 15 had great story and characters, so it's a bit like the things that I didn't like about 13 are still sort of here, but this one actually has a good story and characters that I really like spending time with, so it does escalate it above, and it's a game that I still enjoy at least watching recaps of, or like picking up and playing from time to time. Next up is Final Fantasy X. Now this was a lot of people's first Final Fantasy, and it's a lot of people's favorite Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy X is like the cookie cutter, hits every target Final Fantasy game. There's just a few things about it that I didn't particularly love, and that is mainly to do with the characters in the world. I think it might be a sense of just a throwback to when voice acting was quite new in games. A lot of this was somewhat awkward how they did it. I really hated how they let you name the main character. And this is a huge nitpick. I would just have rather they didn't try and, use like, oh, hey, you over there, or hey, it's that Star Blitzball player, or just call him Titus or Titus, or however you say it. I used to say Titus. Anyway, I would have much preferred they did that, because that really took me out of the game. And I know with the big twist about the main character later on and how you're naming all of your Aeons and stuff, it kind of works, but it also kind of doesn't. I don't like that at all. Spira was a pretty well done world, but I didn't particularly like the story that was told in it. I thought the dad stuff was a bit heavy-handed. And it didn't do a lot for me. The sphere grid was a really good system, and I would love to see that return in a way. I thought that was a really good way of your characters start off running in completely different directions, and then as the game progresses, you can start to sort of merge their jobs over and stuff. Really, really cool. Liked the sphere grid. The ATB is gone. It's just a purely turn-based system now, which you can sort of use time effects to modify a bit. So that works out really well. A lot of post-game content. From this point onwards, these games are all just really, really good, I think. But this one here is probably my least favorite, just for more personal reasons and things about it that I find less enjoyable than the rest of the ones that follow. So 10, a great, very complete Final Fantasy, and a great one to start on. If you're not familiar with this series at all, it still holds up even today. Moving from the crowd pleaser to the other really weird, ugly duckling is Final Fantasy VIII. So Final Fantasy VIII tells what I think is a really strong story. I really like the story and the characters in this. The characters are purposefully unappealing, only so they have nice growth and they have endearing moments in them as the story progresses. Squall sucks when he starts. But then, he gets tortured by Cypher, and you sort of see the duotomy between the two of them. And then towards, he gets put in charge of the garden and becomes, the proper main character. Reluctantly, done really well. I'm glad they did a bit of an antidote to these types of characters in the next game. But I thought it did really well. And, Irvine chickening out. He's got the best memory out of all of them because he's used the GFs the fewest. So he's sort of It was a bit more normal than the other 5. I love it's so different. They could have done it so safe and redid Final Fantasy VII with a different skin on it, for sure. But instead they went, you're in military school, you get paid, you don't make money from fights, you draw your magic out of the monsters. It's like you store it like items now. It's absolutely bizarre. And that's what brings me to what's not so great about this game. It's within everyone's capabilities very quickly to break this game entirely. And not even in the good way. You can sort of break Final Fantasy V if you get really good with the chemist, for example. Things like that. But this game, you can play the card game a bit, get some cards, refine them into magic, hook it up to your strength, and for about an hour into the game, you're just spamming Scroll's Limit Break on everything to win. And the temptation to not do that, and the need to only not do that with a couple of super bosses, is kind of a bummer, and it's hard not to do it. Because I love the story, I like to get my way through the story, and so I find myself just putting the game basically on broken mode and doing so. So a bit of a bummer there, but I really like most things about Final Fantasy VIII, aside from the junction system. Just too much time standing around drawing from enemies, and just too much time spent in menus refining things. Next up is Final Fantasy V. This used to be a lot lower on my list, and I used to think it was like the boring story one. Now, I'm not sure if they've just resharpened a bit of it. They may well have done, but I've been playing the Pixel remaster of this one on my phone lately, and geez, this game is good, and it is charming. Yeah, I laugh every time XIII comes on the screen because he's such a dumb villain. Like, it's such a dumb thing. Like, for no real reason, he's just an angry old wizard that wants to reduce everything to the void. And it's just so silly. But it's like the game always plays to that silliness, and the characters really have like kind of poker faces about that the whole time. And again, this is a game that keeps the party very simple. There's one party change later on, and you basically know your party from the first 20 minutes. You're good and you're off. But it's the job system in this one that really, it's the linchpin of this whole series pretty much. And it's what everyone wants these games to return to, is jobs. People love them because it gives your characters so much variation, versatility. And as I said, you can branch off at the start of the game. So right now I'm dealing with I've got a samurai with the archer's rapid fire move. I've got a summoner / time mage. I've got a chemist / ninja. I've got a blue mage / summoner. Like, it's really, really cool. And next time I play, it'll be entirely different. So such a replayable game. And the story is nice and long. The world changes a few times. It's all very charming, and it's all a bit silly. And it's sort of how I appreciate, I think, these games the most, when they are a bit silly and just, it has a great sort of battle system and great sort of character system underpinning the silliness. And yeah, it's a fairly endearing world. And even with XIII being a very silly villain, it's enough to want to, he does a couple of dastardly things that you do want to see it through to the end and sort it out. So really, really like this one. So next up is 7. So 7, as I said, was my first. And 7 is, I would say that the next 3 are darn near perfect. 7 is the one that has some imperfections, mainly stemming around the materia system, which I don't love. So as I said, what makes Final Fantasy for me is differentiation in the characters, and like basically committing to directions for the characters to go in before you get too far into the game. So then you're sort of stuck with this versatile party. That's what I like the most. Whereas the materia system in Final Fantasy VII, you can basically swap character for character as long as their weapon and armor have the same amount of slots. There are some stats differences for sure, but apart from that, it really just comes down to limit breaks. What I would love to have seen was if the materia, as your characters level up, a bit like in Final Fantasy VI, changed your character's stats for good. Whereas all they do now is it's just when they're currently equipped, they reduce your strength and reduce your hit points and increase your magic and increase your magic points. Like, it's something that I think it's a massive missed opportunity. And I think the remake did a really good job of starting to fiddle with this a bit as well, just making the characters a little bit more unique and versatile, which it had to be because it's a completely different style of game. Loved the remake, by the way, but we're not sort of we're just doing the mainline series, but love the remake. And even in hindsight, I liked what they did with the story beats in that too. I've changed my opinion on that. But with regards to the story, Final Fantasy VII tells a pretty classic story with a lot to think about. Is Sephiroth the bad guy, or is Genova behind it all? Big debate. You can still follow the threads about that and study all that. It's a very well-developed world. They sort of overcooked it a little bit, I would argue, in like the abundance of content that came afterwards. But good core group of characters. I like all the characters in this. Like, I even like Cat Sith, because, you know, Reeve has good reasons for doing what he's doing, and really, really good, well fleshed out world, characters, everything like that. But yeah, just the materia system is what reduces it from being in the top 3 for me. Alrighty, third favorite, Final Fantasy VI. This is like the one that the publications always say is the best. And I think this is probably one really good remake or remaster away from really being escalated up, even with me, because 6 does basically everything right. It's got a really great diverse cast of characters, and it does some really cool left of center story decisions, namely splitting your party up, sending them off into the world, then they'll come back with new friends they've made, and you get this real sort of really alive group of characters that all seem to really interplay with each other and get along. There's a couple of really good set pieces where you have to split your party up and tackle a dungeon from different points. Really, really well done game, story-wise, music-wise, presentation. I mean, the sprite base is older looking now, but really full of character. Love the steampunk type world, was really well done. And even the battle system. Each of the characters was unique. In a sense, they all had their unique skill, but then you could assign espers to them all, and that would increase their stats in certain ways. So, you know, if you stick Sabin with Ifrit from the start of the game and just leave him there, yeah, you won't learn much magic, but he'll be a strength powerhouse by the end. You know, things like that you can do. Lots of variation, versatility to it. And yeah, just this wacky world and these story beats, you know. The bad guy wins about 2/3 of the way through the game. He just wins. And then the rest of the game you spent picking up the pieces, but it's never the same. Like, there's a good, like, half an hour to an hour of the game where it just completely throws the handbrake on, and you're trying to get off this island when the world resumes. And, you know, personally, I can never find enough of those fast swimming fucking fish to bring Sid around. But I don't know, I think that's just a matter of luck. But anyway, such crazy, like, especially for its time, but even now, crazy story beats, really good systems, and just full of character, brimming with quality. Final Fantasy VI is definitely top tier Final Fantasy. Second to last, Final Fantasy XII is, I think, the best playing Final Fantasy. It is so addictive and so fun. It sort of mixes like the world of Evilus, which they've used in a couple of the side games, with a really robust like MMO style battle system with like a lot you can do in it, a lot you can change in it. The styles of battle are so varied. Using the Gambit system, you can set your AIs to do really intelligent things, or just the things you exactly want them to do. So you're not dicking around in menus as much anymore. Just to have your random battles, you can sort of just, as long as you set it up at first, the battle will sort of resolve itself, which sounds weird, but it's really not, because there is so much customization. Especially when you go and get the Zodiac version and you can do your own jobs. I love how they let you do that. And basically every job is good as long as you combine it with the right kind of other job. So much to do, so much to think about. Really, really well playing game. Love the battle system, and the character progression system is fantastic. People often knock this for having a weak story, and I think that is completely the opposite. Now, you play as Vaan, and Vaan is a softer main character, like he has less presence to him. But this is a very purposeful narrative decision, because they're putting the player in as like the fish out of water, watching the real story unfold. The main character of this story is Balthier and Ash. Like, they're the main characters. Like, Balthier has a link to who you would argue is the main villain, Cid, and then Ash is like the Deus Ex of the whole, you know, the nation you're trying to help overall. She's the princess of it. And then you've got some of the best voice acting, writing I've ever seen in a video game. Like, from Final Fantasy X before this one, which, you know...
Hey. Ha!
This was just... the dialogue is like old English, almost Shakespearean. It's very much in line with like what we've seen in Vagrant Story or Final Fantasy Tactics. Whenever they give this team the drive behind a full Final Fantasy game, they do such good work.
So you have lived.
I am Judge Magister. Even in disgrace, my just reward for aiding the empire that destroyed my homeland.
No farther! Sky pirates, the future of Dalmasca will not be stolen. Why do this, Bash? This struggle is futile. You must know where it leads.
I do know. All too well.
And it's a political story. There's a bit of toing and froing. And you need to sort of focus on it. But there's just such good character moments. And the world is just amazingly huge. There are parts of this game that the story would never even bring you in, that you basically need to go off and find fully fledged, like the Necrohole of Nabudish. You don't even need to go there for anything, really. There are things that just, you can go off and spend hours just exploring, and then you can come straight back to the main narrative. It's really easy to do that whenever you want. Excellent game. The open world, it feels like they've tacked on a nice open world to something of as quality as Final Fantasy X. The art style is still really, really good, especially when they've put the HD skins on it. Now they just look like these amazing oil painting type characters. Such an intelligent decision. Excellent game. Almost my favorite, if not for the absolutely fantastic story and characters of Final Fantasy IX. So Final Fantasy IX is my favorite, basically because of the story and the characters. Zidane, Steiner, and Vivi are the three best Final Fantasy characters ever, all in the one game. They are so good together. All the characters in this are pretty good, except for maybe Armorant. They just don't do enough with him. But Zidane, Vivi, and Steiner, the other characters, they're foils for the other characters. Zidane is what you needed after Squall and Cloud. Just an outright leader, like a complete, like proper, neutral good, lawful good hero. With great sense of humor, like comedy behind him, brave, all that stuff that you want to play. And it's got the power fantasy. Turns out he's actually really super strong. He starts off as a thief. You're like, oh, a thief, okay. Like, usually your main character's like a knight or something like that. But no, you see all about him. It's such good history. Really great interplay between him and the main villain. Excellently told story. Some of these moments in this game still get me in the feelings. Particularly the Black Mage village sections are just devastating, and they're so well done. The music and the world and all of the wacky creatures that live in it. The full motion videos, even with their eidolons and stuff, they're just you couldn't make this game better. The one thing that some people might not like about it is that the battle system really goes back to somewhere between 4 and 6, where it's very much like your characters have roles, but then rather than just learning all their skills to level up, you still need to be a bit of an item hunter and find the items to give your characters the right skills. So I love it. Love the side stories you can go on. Chocobo Hot and Cold is just perfect. So much to do in the game, so much character and everything. I love how you can just open up the menu and look at all the items, and they've got some funny little blurb about them. It's all so well realized and well formed. And as they always say, this is the love letter to everyone before this game who loved all the Final Fantasies before it, and it's done so well. I'm looking at Final Fantasy XVI, and I'm hoping they pull from this and 12 and learn from the perhaps mistakes they made with 15 and 13 and really draw it home. So hopefully it's going to be a good year for Final Fantasy with Stranger in Paradise. Best case scenario, it's going to turn out to be like the Metal Gear Rising of the Final Fantasy games. It looks super cheesy, but hopefully with Team Ninja behind it, it should be technically brilliant. And then Final Fantasy XVI, if they get that out this year, fingers crossed for it, I'll get a PS5 and we'll play the heck out of it. Okay, that's my Final Fantasy video. Only doing it because some people have actually asked. I use the music all the time in my videos because it is literally some of the best, easiest to use music, because video game music, this is why I use video game music, because people do Let's Plays, which benefits the companies, and just generally, I think the companies are attuned to that having their properties out there on things like YouTube does them benefit. So who knows, maybe from this video, a couple of you will even go out and play a Final Fantasy game that you've never played before. I would start personally with 9, just because it's got such a good story. But if you're after just something really solid, 10 or 12, can't go wrong. 7, no problems at all. 5 if you're after something a bit more rustic, just for the fun of the job system. Anyway, guys, that's all the talking. I'm going to take my Final Fantasy addled brain and fuck off now and hopefully do some knife videos for you in the next little while. Peace out.